Hello, everybody. My name is Amy Hanratty, and I'm a professor of special education at the California State University Northridge in the Department of Special Education. My co-presenter, Rachel Woodward, is unfortunately not be able to get on with me to record today, but she's the director of special education at Wish Charter School and was very instrumental in the resources that I'm going to talk about today and developing this presentation as well. So I'm here to talk about developing inclusive programs for students with extensive needs, and specifically to share with you a resource that we developed last year during distance learning that we think is relevant, not just for distance learning, but also a really valuable resource for inclusive programs overall. So this resource was developed in very close partnership and by faculty and parents and students at Wish Charter School. Wish is a TK through 12th grade charter school in Westchester, California. And among other tenets, some of the core elements of Wish's structure is really around creating systems to support inclusive practices for all students. So that includes collaboration and co-teaching, differentiated instruction, and close partnerships with parents. And as you'll see, that this project was really designed with the idea of close partnerships with parents as a critical aspect of distance learning for students with extensive support needs. So as everybody knows by now, in March 2020, we had a little bit of a surprise, and schools closed for in-person instruction, and we thought it would be a short-term closure that really became a pretty long-term closure. And so as a result of these school closures, a school like Wish that was designed to be inclusive really had to come to terms with how they would design distance learning to be fundamentally inclusive of students with extensive support needs that really need a high level of support to access their instruction. And so Wish was part of a community of practice that I was part of organizing that started pretty quickly around March, where we brought together some educators and school leaders just to talk about what we think learning should look like for students with extensive support needs during this time. And I'll be honest that at the beginning, we really had no idea, couldn't even envision what it could look like. But we continued to meet, we continued to kind of share what was working and what wasn't so far. We pulled some information from a survey that was distributed to families and started to pull together some ideas of what we felt might be a strong representation of a good distance learning program. So the more we talked and the more we really thought about what were core elements of a strong distance learning program for students with extensive support needs, we really found that we went back to what we know are key evidence-based and promising practices pre-COVID-19. So we know that emphasis on access to meaningful instruction in general education was no less relevant during distance learning than it was before. And in fact, we really needed to think about not just access to meaningful instruction in general education, but also within home and community routines. And you'll see some examples of how we did that. High levels of collaboration, coordination, and teaming across professionals and families was just as important as it was before, as well as embedded communication and literacy instruction, progress monitoring, embedding social supports and relationship building, self-determination, making topics age appropriate, but also adjusted in format or complexity based on individual student needs. And then you see there's a big gold star next to close collaboration with families, because there was no way to embed a high quality distance learning program without that close collaboration with families. So as we started to kind of refine what do these key pieces really look like in practice, we had educators who were problem solving really as we went along because they had to, because they were in a position of needing to create accessible instruction in the moment for students. And I couldn't be more grateful for the educators that volunteered themselves to be part of this project, Excellence Together, because they're the ones that really allowed us to showcase the work that they were doing. So you see, we really kind of narrowed down our focuses in terms of what a high quality program looks like into these 4 different elements. So we focused on starting with family voice and listening to families about what was working and what wasn't. Then we use that information to embed goals, the IEP goals, within typical activities during the student's day. We facilitated discussions around environmental and instructional supports, and then embedded synchronous instructional opportunities that incorporated co-teaching and universal design for learning. So if you look at all 4 of these pieces, these came together because of the necessity of utilizing these within distance learning. As we went through this process of refining the materials and the resources associated with each of these different elements, we really just found that we were solidifying processes that were already in place before COVID-19, but then really became core elements of students' programs, even as they're now returning to in-person instruction. So what we developed was a resource website. And it's called Excellence Together. And this, when you go to this website, excellencetogether.org, you just have to click, there's some welcome information about this project, a little bit of an overview, and then there are resources focused on elementary school and secondary or middle and high school. And so if you just click on, they have similar resources, but if you click on one, then you'll see that each of those 4 critical pieces has its own site. And if you click on one of them, like family support plan, there are some kind of mini vignettes from the parent perspective, an educator perspective, and then a researcher perspective that explains kind of the underlying research and evidence-based practices that align with each of these pieces. And then there's a longer video that goes into a little bit more detail about what is this practice, what does it look like, and then of course videos of it in practice. And then for each of them, there's also some related materials, including templates that you can use in your own practice. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this presentation is just kind of share a little bit more about each of those 4 elements, and then show some of the shorter video clips so that you can get a sense of the voice of teachers and families throughout this process. So the first piece that we're going to look at is the family support plan. And the family support plan really is just a template of a form that guides educators and families through a conversation around what does the family hope to get out of, in this case, distance learning, although now we're adapting it to really focus on what do they hope to get out of this school year. And really thinking about how this could be used as a tool in preparation for things like IEP meetings. So the focus here is really on starting our process with listening to the family, understanding their unique needs, and then really hearing from them about what does their daily routine look like, or what does their weekly schedule look like, and really tailoring students' programs around the needs of the family. So we start that conversation by asking families about their hopes for the remainder of the school year. What do they hope their child will have accomplished? What are the hopes for their family? And what do they hope will change compared to whatever they're experiencing now? We also, of course, ask families about their greatest concerns and what they want to avoid, and what their worries are related to, in this case, distance learning. This is really a format that's consistent with person-centered planning and is nothing new, but we really focused on applying it in a really practical way so that educators could use this as part of their ongoing conversations with families. So we asked families, based on their experiences so far, what types of supports have been most useful to them, and prompt educators to list things that have been used so far and ask for feedback on them, as opposed to only asking as an open-ended question. And then start to think about new ideas for supports based on the family's hopes and concerns and the things that they've liked so far. So here's a short video really focused on the teacher perspective of the family support plan.
As a special educator, partnering with families is already a big part of my job. My co-teachers and I always work to get family input on the educational program for my students.
Then I just use these as well.
Oh, yay! Oh, we love the fact families. When we first shifted to distance learning, it was very clear that our programs cannot be one size fits all for such a diverse group of students.
Let's count them all together. I said, ready?
The Family Support Plan helps us to tailor a distance learning program. It addresses the unique needs of students who need a great deal of support at home to access their educational program. Since the program is collaboratively designed around the priorities of the family, we are all invested in the activities we agree on. If it's working, we don't want to mess with it too much, but I think it is good to have that set time because, like, you're right, positive reinforcement is so important.
Yeah.
This tool is now an essential part of my work as a special educator during distance learning.
So in addition to WISH using the family support plan, we know that inclusion teachers at Los Angeles Unified School District started to use it. Several other of our partner schools started to use that family support plan. So it's just a simple template, but a really helpful way to start the conversation about supports and services in a way that's a little bit more family-centered than our conventional approach. So, after that initial conversation with families, the next step that we focused on was creating a template for embedding those IEP goals within typical activities. So we call that the Goal Activity Matrix Education Plan, so a game plan. So again, goal activity matrices are really nothing new. This has been a really critical strategy in connecting individual student skills and goals to the context in which those skills are learned, and making sure that they're learned and practiced in a meaningful setting. So it's not a new skill or not a new strategy, but we really wanted to make it part of this this broader system of connected supports. So here's a parent sharing a little bit about her experience with the goal activity matrix, and then I'll explain a little bit more about that process.
When COVID-19 mandated school closures, my girls had to start learning from home.
So it's 1774. We're going to look at two different scenarios.
I didn't know how to support Abby to participate in many of her middle school classes.
Like, how would you guys vote? Would you comply with the English and be like, yeah, Boston, you need to...
This major shift to supporting Abby to access all of her schooling from home was overwhelming. My stress level lowered when Abby's teacher reached out to me to make a plan.
How are things going with Abby's program?
The plan included how she would participate in her classes online and work on her goals at home.
And so what you do is you say, okay, I have to get 10 goldfish pieces for Emmy.
1, 2, 3.
And then, here's the tricky part. This second 10 frame will be for the negative integers.
2.
There were many specific things, such as math and writing, that I didn't have practice teaching. Everything was also delivered virtually. I had to be my own tech person. The game plan meeting helped me understand her distance learning opportunities. Abby was able to be much more active in her online classes when I knew the types of supports that I could provide and the types of questions her teachers would ask. We also came up with many ways we could work on IEP goals at home. One of the silver linings of the pandemic has been learning more about how we can include learning and skill practice throughout our typical daily routines.
So I just want to, I'm going to go back actually to a spot in that video because I was able to observe this meeting with Abby's family and her teacher as we were filming. And the skill that they were focused on for this goal activity matrix, you can see was focused on positive and negative numbers. And they focused on how Abby was going to practice positive and negative numbers during both typical synchronous like Zoom class instruction. So they talked about during math class. They also talked about during other classes, how she could take attendance and practice connecting positive and negative numbers within those activities. But then they also embedded, because they listened to information from the family during that family support plan about things that the family was already doing at home. So instead of making it overwhelming and adding more activities at home, they worked on embedding these skills within the activities that Abby was already doing. And so you see that one of the activities that was part of their daily routine was helping to feed her younger sister. So they always had after school time, they always had a snack where the little sister had to eat something, and Abby liked to help out with that. And you saw the video that they incorporated some games with the little sister to practice with her snack positive and negative numbers. And then the one that I really wanted to point out, because they said that Abby, one of her favorite things was to go on TikTok when she finished school for the day. And she was really interested in how many followers she had. And so she started to track each day how many followers she had, and then would keep track of how many she gained or lost, and would apply that to positive and negative numbers. So a really fun way to incorporate that skill in a very practical application that was interesting to her. Okay, so just a little bit more about the goal activity matrix. So you saw an example of this table. It's all it is the goals on one side, and we suggested that teachers just start with one goal so they get familiar with the format, introduce it in that way with the family, and kind of get one goal rolling, and then start to add more and more goals as they went along. So the focus is on embedding instruction into typical instruction in class and in-home activities. The way that we set up this table for distance learning was that we made sure that there were at least 2 activities during synchronous instruction or Zoom instruction, and at least 2 activities for practice during asynchronous time. So whatever the natural home activity was, things that were already happening. We were trying to avoid creating what felt like extra work for families to do. So first step is to choose a target goal. And so together with the family, they worked on choosing one thing they wanted to start with that was a priority. And sometimes that was something that they had really struggled with figuring out how to practice it in a meaningful way. Okay, and then the teachers would kind of pre-plan some ideas for how the student might practice this skill during regular school activities. So in this case, during synchronous distance learning. And you can see that in this example, this was for a student where they were focused on using their communication device to talk about vocabulary of things being more, less, or the same. And so 2 ways that they were going to practice that skill. One was during their English language arts classes or sessions, and they would focus on incorporating concepts like more, less, and the same when talking about images of characters or objects from the book, and would work on incorporating it there. And then during math, they were working on place value for this particular student, and so the student was working on using ones, tens, and hundreds cubes to display quantities, and they would talk about, again, concepts of more, less, and the same. So then the next step, though, during distance learning, and this is one thing that we feel like can continue following distance learning, is really talking about when does this skill apply in a natural setting at home, right? So if skills are meaningful, they don't only happen at school, they should be happening all the time. And so we really talk to families about brainstorming ways in which students could practice some of these skills at home within typical activities. So you saw the example of Abby and the positive and negative integers. And for this student, we also focused on a mealtime as a really easy way for the family to incorporate talking about more, less, and the same as they're talking about describing portions that everybody has at the table. And then one of the other things that this student did was their family went for a walk most days. And so they were focused on talking about things that they noticed are the same when they're outside. And then also inviting if they'd like to walk more. So once they've kind of done some pre-planning, then of course the teachers meet together with the families to have a conversation about that game plan, get feedback and suggestions, and kind of start to refine the plan. Through those conversations, sometimes we saw that we had to kind of narrow the skill a little bit, that parents were feeling often a little overwhelmed with, how do you want me to implement this? They didn't want it to feel like more work, like I mentioned. So we really focused on kind of really tailoring to what did the family feel was the most manageable in terms of those home pieces. So that was the game plan. And then another piece that we addressed was focused on environmental and instructional supports. So we know that students, in order to access general education, often require a full range of supports and services to access instruction. We wanted to make sure that even during distance learning, that we were really considering that full range of supports and thinking about ways in which we could support families, and teachers and families could work together to create kind of environmental situations that were conducive to learning, and make sure that students had the same access to the types of supports they had in school while they were at home. So here's a quick video of a teacher talking about those supports.
When we first moved to distance learning, I went back to the classrooms to gather as many items as I could to help with instruction at home. And here goes 4 on this side. After trying things out and collaborating with parents, I realized I need to go back to campus and gather even more environmental and instructional support. I just have 3 of those like big red wagons sitting around. If we were having trouble getting work done, I said, well, go sit in the wagon. And he has a little laptop on his lap, working on his stuff, sitting in the, I could just roll him, just a little motion. These were things that I had used to create engagement, sustained participation, and embedded instruction. This is a good time to get your Legos out, your blocks. Like, look at it, I put 4 and 4 on each side, and that scale is balanced. Some of these tools are things like anchor charts, study carols, and timers that can be used as is. And others, like the daily picture schedule or first then chart, needed to be adjusted for the home environment to make it effective. Talking through them with parents and collaborating on adjustments helped us both create supports for goal implementation at home and be on the same page.
Instead of using his talker, I use a whiteboard and give him choices.
Anytime he can select a break and advocate for himself and say, I need this to calm down, I mean, that's what we want, right? So that as he gets older, he knows the things that are gonna work to de-escalate. As time goes on, we will continue to refine the tools identified in the initial family support plan and the goal activity matrix.
So really, this is all about what are the tools and resources that students need in order to be successful. Now, this is the same as in person, right? That students need to have those tools and materials and visual supports or tactile supports in order to access the curriculum. And again, this just makes consideration of that range of supports and services and resources part of that this same kind of structured conversation over several meetings. Okay, so you see environmental supports was the whole focus is on those tools to support access, positive behavior, and also independence, which was an important part of that conversation with families, is supporting that continued growth and self-determination for students. So you see, we went through with teachers the different steps, really thinking about what are the tools that would be used with the student during in-person instruction, and then really then communicating with the family and thinking about which of these tools might help in a home setting. We talked about things like checklists, not just picture schedules, but how can we help the student participate in managing tasks within the home. So then teachers made those tools or adapted them for the home. Held a meeting again with families. So we had another template prepared for teachers to use to facilitate that conversation. And again, really focus on explaining how would this tool be used and implemented with students in the home environment. Try to not make it overly complicated, use plain language, giving explicit examples, and even demonstrating what those tools might look like in practice. And I know on the website, there is an example of a mom talking through what that looked like for her with her son. Okay, and then finally, the last piece that we focused on was the instructional piece. So after we created all of these supports and talked about embedding goals, we really have to make sure that the instruction itself that we're providing, and remember we're talking about inclusive practices. So we wanted to create accessible general education instruction that was inclusive of students with more extensive support needs. And so to do that, we really had to go back to what we already know are evidence-based and promising practices of co-teaching and universal design for learning. So last video, so here's a high school teacher talking about co-teaching and universal design for learning.
Most of our secondary special education teachers are assigned to one grade level and primarily co-teach with English and math teachers. With our additional slots of time, we co-plan and co-teach additional subjects as well.
So me and you are going to work on this together for a little bit. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Alrighty.
Our goal is for students to make progress on their individual goals within all their general education content and elective classes. This year I'm working as the high school transition teacher, so I co-plan and co-teach while focusing on integrating learning opportunities around autonomies that can be developed for transitioning into the program each student chooses after high school. Careful planning and collaboration are necessary to ensure that these students can continue to get their needs met and have a seamless transition to their post-secondary experience.
To be highlighting what we have learned about so far.
Sounds good with me.
Co-teaching during synchronous instruction, providing individualized supports and materials, and having one-on-one check-ins with students and families have been our most effective strategies during distance learning. Collaborative planning time with each general education teacher allows us to plan engaging lessons. We take the needs of all students into consideration by infusing universal design for learning components such as multiple means of engaging students, representing content, and allowing students to express their knowledge. We also plan individualized participation options for students with extensive support needs and focus on how we will team teach or break classes into smaller groups during instruction.
I'm going to create a space for you to share with the class what a word means. Does that sound like a plan?
Mm.
Okay.
So you can see there, and in some of the examples, that we really worked on modeling student participation within many of these meetings. So, and particularly among the older grades. So in all of the video examples for middle school and high school, you'll see students with extensive support needs participating in those meetings and really actively kind of engaging in some of the decision making around the supports that that might be most effective for them. So we did talk about co-teaching and the video on the website. If I go to here, the video on co-teaching and universal design for learning, there's that longer video, does give a little bit more detail around what that looked like during distance learning. But one of the things that we really emphasize is that those regrouping approaches, especially when students are on Zoom, but I would argue that this is the same in person, but co-teaching approaches where students are breaking into 2 groups for parallel teaching, or one group, one larger group and a smaller group, like a breakout room for alternative teaching, or all students in smaller groups, which is called station teaching, really were those co-teaching models that had the most power during distance learning. And again, I would really argue that those are some of the ones that have the most power during in-person teaching as well, because we're getting kids into smaller groups, allows for much stronger differentiation than some of the whole group co-teaching strategies. So we also talked about universal design for learning. This isn't a presentation just about UDL, but this is really just focused on many different ways for students to take in information, different ways for students to express what they've learned, and making sure that they're engaged in the process. So we talked about UDL in those live meetings or synchronous meetings, different ways to take in information, express information, and stay engaged and hooked into the learning. And these are just some examples, things like you heard a mention of anchor charts, using materials from home, using total physical response. This was a high school teacher talking about slope, and using some incorporating projects within those synchronous learning times. But it was equally important to be talking about universal design and asynchronous activities. So the things that students were doing when they weren't in direct instruction. So again, during in-person instruction now, we still have to be thinking about UDL in terms of the types of things that students are doing when they're outside of school. So for homework and projects, are we incorporating all of these elements, different ways for students to take in information, express what they know, and remain engaged in the topic. So across everything, and this was a big project to try to pull together what do we think are best practices, and then really work on creating systems that are practical for teachers, that teachers will actually use to embed these systems within their practice. And then our final goal was to provide a way to disseminate or showcase those systems to others, which is what we have in that website. So some of the things that we learned, one is that our families reported that they learned that things like specially designed instruction can really happen in all settings. And we learned that we can really tailor programs to the student when we incorporate that family input. Also, families reported that those environmental tools were incredibly helpful and weren't always things that they knew about, things that they didn't know that they needed, right? So now we know that those tools need to be sent home and then redesigned to make sure that they work with family needs and to be effective in the home setting. And also that families just continue to teach us how to better serve students. I know that teachers have countless examples of things that they learned from families through this process of multiple meetings, really listening to families tell about what was most effective for them and for their kids. On the educator side, I think that another learning was that the family support plan continued to evolve and change. It wasn't like we just made a plan at one point in the school year and stuck with it. Because students' needs changed, the formats changed as we continued to evolve in providing distance learning opportunities. And so those plans continue to evolve as well. Just like there's talk about the IEP being a living document, the family support plan is also a living document. We discussed meeting early and often with families during all instructional models. So again, this is part now of systems related to traditional in-person instruction. We didn't just leave it as we started to move back to in-person. And then finally, just the importance of prioritizing co-planning and co-teaching to really support that accessible instruction for all students. So if we definitely encourage you to check out the website. So it's excellencetogether.org. And then you can look at some of the resources, the templates that are on there, as well as all of those video vignettes and the longer one for each of those 4 areas for both elementary and secondary students. And we welcome your questions. So again, Rachel Woodward, who wasn't able to co-present with me, is the Director of Special Education at Wish Charter. And so her email is here, rwoodward@wishcharter.org. And my email is here too, amy.hanready@csun.edu. Thank you for listening. I hope this was helpful. Bye-bye.